what your students are actually thinking about the class. And I find I always ask them a question of what's one thing that you think could be improved, and I'll always address this in class. So if they say, usually it's like, they'll give you tons of ideas that you're never going to implement, but if you can just choose one and actually change that thing, then it really makes them feel like you've heard them and you've listened and you're taking their feedback seriously. Did you have?
I'm thinking the key with that too is to do that in public with your students, to get that feedback so that they all know what the feedback is, so that you can let them know that you have changed it, because if you change something that one student requested, and that's not a public change, then there won't be this sense of appreciation because it's anonymous. Well, the one student's anonymous, but
for sure.
They have to know that you changed it in response to get that effect.
Yeah, so I'll actually take 10 minutes in class after the survey results are in and put up these things and say, and here were your suggestions for improvement. Well, I'm not going to do that. So for example, they asked me, we don't like using Excel in tutorial. Can we have less graphing in Excel? And I said, nope, sorry, that's one of the skills you're learning in tutorial, so I'm not taking that out. But they did also ask for, they were finding tutorials a bit too long and wanted to have more context for them before coming to tutorial. And I said, great idea, yeah, I can do that, no problem. So yeah, and so we go over this in class and they hear you saying that.
Yeah, I'm surprised by the learning goals one, that's something by which they learn actually quite a bit. So how do you state them? Sort of what would be sort of when you start your class? How are you stated?
So basically, here, I went through this. It's very similar to the ones I put at the beginning of this workshop. So things like this. So always, always measurable in some way. So they always link to what we're doing. So for example, discuss the evidence for efficacy of active learning. That's what all these activities were about, right? Defining active learning, we did that again with an activity. So activities shouldn't just be random things for fun. They should be linked to whatever your goals are, and then students start to see that. And I only test them on on information, or not information, but material that's covered by learning goals, and they make that clear to them. So it gives them a framework for, okay, what does she really want us to learn in this course, in this class period? And how can I do that? So it gives them, kind of a map or framework for their...
You're setting expectations.
Exactly.
That's really...
Yeah. So I understand that, but that helps them learn, maybe because then they know what to focus on.
I think so. Yeah, because they're overwhelmed. If there's, sometimes it's like you were saying, Kristen, before, where with the graphing, where we come in with this expert bias and we put up material that to us it's easy. Like we deal with this every day and we can interpret things very easily. And similarly with a lot of material, like students can very quickly get cognitive overload where there's too much and they don't know what to focus on, and then they just shut down.
So with EBS 100 then, you don't do the conventional lectures?
No, I mean, I always lecture a bit.
But it's mixed in with this.
Yeah, I would say I lecture for maximum 10-15 minutes at a time, and then even have something like an ABCD question, or something to break it up so that they're doing something. And then I'll often do that, just kind of an interactive lecture where it's still a lecture, but I'm asking them those questions and getting them to discuss. Not every class has move around worksheet activities, but there's always something.
What about classes with tutorials? Is that the same format? And then the tutorials would be certainly more active with.
Yeah, so EBSC 100 has tutorials, and the way Marnie designed them, and which I do as well, is they're focused on skills. So, I always link them to whatever topic we're doing in class that week in terms of the material, but really they're focused on critical thinking or graphing, graph interpretation or data analysis or scientific literacy, things like that. But I think there's a place for, even though there's a tutorial, there's still a place for the active learning in the lecture. too.
Yeah,
Yeah,
cool.
yeah. Yeah.
Yes, I have a question around reading. So first of all, is it, so I see that you're already giving them in 100 articles from the primary research literature, and then sort of do they also have to do textbook readings? And then my second question is, how do you make sure they do the reading?
Yeah. So I don't start them with primary literature. I definitely build them up to being able to understand how to read those papers. And you know, that was a very simple paper to read. It was more of, it's like, it was an article. It wasn't really a research study per se. So I pick those readings very carefully, and I'll very often give them actually more popular scientific literature to read that is maybe summarizing, you know, academic literature. Textbook, there are corresponding textbook chapters to most of the material in this class, but I have it as optional reading, so it's not, I give them kind of mandatory readings every time, but those are different from the textbook. So I say that the textbook is background for them, and it's very good context, but it's not, I won't be testing them on the textbook material. Yeah, and how I make sure they read it, so in this class I didn't do this. I have in the past given them really quick pre-class easy reading quizzes just to make sure they've done it. So not complex questions, just like recall kind of questions about the reading. That works very well. And just assign a very small portion of points to it. So, you know, it motivates them to actually do it. But I find also what works in terms of motivation is they learn pretty early on in the class that if they don't do the reading, they won't really be able to participate in these activities, and then they feel kind of dumb, and not dumb, but they just feel like they're not carrying their weight with their classmates, and that holds a lot of importance for them.
That's what we hear with the millennial generation.
Yeah.
You know, is that they thrive on interactivity and group work, right?
Yeah.
And like it's a generational thing. So that would really play into that generational.
It does, and for sure there are still students who don't do the readings. I know that.
Yeah.
I'm not naive.
Yeah.
But then, you know, and I always say, okay, if you haven't done the reading, pull it up. But I'm not going to help them along. I won't summarize the reading for them. So, you know, because that just negates the work that the students have done that have actually read it. So.
Sorry, I missed when you do this little sort of test. Do you do it sort of before they come to lecture? Okay, so by a Canvas or?
Canvas, yeah. There's actually a term for it. It's called just-in-time teaching, where it's, you know, there's a term for everything, but whatever. It's just a little, pre-class reading quiz, and it's just right before class. They have to complete it the night before or something. And it's also, if you have time, I mean, most people don't have time, but if you do have time to kind of scan through the answers, and sometimes you can catch really big, you know, either misconceptions or just things that they they're not answering things properly, basically. And sometimes you can catch that and then address it in class, but that's not always a necessary component. Something else we were talking about earlier is using two-stage collaborative exams, and I know Marnie, you've done, and Kristen, you've done them too. And I can't remember if you.
I have done them,
Yeah.
but I didn't do them this semester.
Yeah.
I had 1 hour blocks this semester.
Oh,
so
that's
didn't work.
hard. Yeah, for sure. And really 50 minutes, right?
Yeah.
Which is really 40 minutes.
Yeah.
You know?
It was impossible.
I know. So these exams, basically the students write their midterm or final the way they always would, as an individual exam, and then they turn it in, and then they get into groups of 3 or 4, and then they get the same exam back and have to come to a consensus on answers, and they just get 1 per group. So it reinforces this idea of collaboration that, you know, if you're doing it all the time in class with activities and things, why not do it in the assessment as well? It turns the assessment into also a learning opportunity, so they're able to discuss their answers right after. And anyway, it's an interesting sort of extension of this active learning.
Can I ask you, how do you let them know that what they're doing, or when do you let them know that what they're talking about in class, like these kind of assignments, are going because you had specific questions there, right, that related back to these. So are you doing that like right from the beginning, like first day, make sure you're here sort of thing? And
I just say that I'm testing you on those learning goals that are at the start of every lecture. So that one had that worksheet had a clear learning goal that matched it, and that was the only place in that class that we addressed that goal. So I'm not gonna say this worksheet will be on the exam,
Right.
but they know that they have to think, okay, what have we done in this class period or with readings or that can address that learning goal, and that was that reading in that worksheet.
because it seems like that's the driver, right? That gets them, because you don't have to take attendance if they know that that's going to be on the assessment and they know that they need to be in class to learn that material, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they get the participation mark.
They get a point for doing it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't correct those, that would take forever. It's really just that they're engaged in the activity, and you can get a feel if, you're circulating around the room and you can hear what students are talking about and, correct them if they're way off on the wrong track, but they get themselves on the right track in the group work, almost always. Yeah. Yeah. I had a few, tips that we've actually talked about some already, but maybe it's a good place to move on to these. So just in terms of how to implement things like this in classes, there's obviously lots of considerations, including how many students you have, what your classroom setup is, what you want them to get out of these activities, what your motivation is for doing them. But these are just some kind of general tips. So again, it's really important to have a focus for the activity. So again, it's not just something that you're throwing in to make it more fun. It should be tied to either a learning goal that you have. If you use learning goals, if you don't, that's fine. Or some, important topic that you really want them to internalize from that class period. So that's important. You need to decide how the students will be engaging with the material. So once you have the material that you want to cover, what's the best way to do that? Is it with a worksheet? Is it better suited to kind of multiple choice questions like that and a little peer discussion? Is it something where you could have movement? So I'll show you this activity in a minute. Just think about what the best way to get across the material is. That motivation piece, so we've already talked about that. So how will they be motivated to put in the effort, whether it's, for sure there's that extrinsic motivation of the participation points or grades or whatever. It's important. But also, like I said, often they just don't want to let down their peers, so that can be a really strong motivator. Also, they love anything that's about themselves, like anything that relates to their own lives. So EVSE 100 is a gold mine for that. It's just like the first toothbrush you ever owned is still out there somewhere. Don't be a plastic polluter. There's just so many things that you can connect to their lives, and that really gives them motivation to learn the material, I find. Planning the logistics. So obviously, as you can guess, like running these kinds of activities in class, it takes some planning. You can't just do it on the fly. So again, once you decide what type of activity you want to use or what strategy, you just need to think in terms of timing. How long will it take? What are the students doing? What am I doing while they're working on this? How do I make sure they're on the right track? All of these little pieces you want to think about as much as you can ahead of time, and then reflect on it afterwards. So what went well, what didn't? So maybe it was way too confusing to have them moving around the classroom. Maybe they didn't understand your instructions. They weren't clear enough. So it always helps to have that reflection quickly after. And finally, the last and probably most important piece of advice I would give if you're interested in kind of implementing any of these kind of things is to just start small. Like, you don't have to do the entire class with active learning. You can, in a 50-minute class, throw in a 5-minute activity or put in a few little mini discussions or something like that, and just see how it goes and play around with what works best for your context and your students and your material. Yeah, that would probably be my best advice.
And you've built this over many years of
Yes.
additive,
Yes,
right?
totally.
It becomes easier after a while, because that is a lot of extra work, isn't it? I dare say you're probably doing 10 times as much in the classroom in terms of varieties of activities than most instructors are.
Yeah, it's a lot of work up front in the planning part, but then once you're in the class, I mean, first of all, you're not exhausting yourself by just talking the whole time. You know, it's so much more fun.
Yeah.
And once you have kind of your toolbox of activities or strategies or whatever you want to call them, you learn where to pull them out and where, you know, it didn't take me long to come up with these worksheets for this workshop, you know?
Yeah.
So it's like anything, it's a practice, right? Yeah. In the long term, I think it actually means less work to prepare a lecture because you're not going through notes and tons of material and that the students won't remember anyway because they have limited capacity to take in, you know, information.
Yeah.
I try to have no more than 5 or 6 learning goals for even a 90-minute class or a 2-hour class period and just really focus on those bigger goals. Yeah.
I personally think about, you know, this activity kind of based learning is the way to go. And I mean, traditionally, lecture is good, right? Because, you know, people, no internet, everyone have to listen. But nowadays, you know, half a class, they're with their computer, you know what, they're not with really class.
Yeah.
They're actually somewhere else. So if you just do regular kind of lecture, no, they just continue doing it that way, you know, their own way. So this kind of activity and force them to leave their mind from the computer to have their classroom engagement. I found myself because I look at my student and they start to look at their face, right? They're so happy. I said, you know, I'm not going to teach anything, you know, that happy, you know, that funny, but I know they're talking to their friend.
It's funny, right? In the AQ, we got all these new classrooms, but they have the gridded seats, which makes it really difficult. At least if, you know, this is where I generally have the lectures. Makes it difficult to move around.
Yeah.
So yeah, I have this class is in the EVSC 100's in the AQ.
Yeah.
And I still make them move around. It's a
It's
little,
still possible, yeah.
yeah,
difficult,
it's
but-
trickier for
but
sure.
it's doable.
It's
Yeah.
doable though.
We should have a more round table. And,
Oh, I mean-
yeah, when I kind of, currently I'm teaching I just finished my class, and I have a group kind of a discussion. I ask them to read one kind of paper in weekly, you know, one paper, just like basically research paper.
Yeah.
So I ask each of them to see, you know, pick out 3 things you like most about that paper, about that research. 3 things you don't like it, or you see there's a way for improvement. So that's why I ask each of them to read the paper and then have group discussion and then have whole class discussion.
That's a very good activity.
So that kind of will, everyone have to, you know, come up with 3 kind of.
Yeah, and in a larger class size, like intro course, you can do something similar,
Yeah.
but it's not gonna look exactly the same.
Yeah,
That's all.
yeah, exactly.
I-
Yeah, you just have to modify, you can do much of the same, many of the same things in the large classes, you just have to modify them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I personally, I see, you know, students, I love it because there's no other way. You have to, you know, I ask a question, you have to, you know, what 3 things you like most, right? You have
Yeah.
to know, you have to read the paper, otherwise you kind of come out something, you know, and also be criticized their work with the paper. You don't like it, why you don't like it?
Yeah, it's very good. It's
You
teaching
have to come out with
people.
everything you don't like. That's the force everyone to do.
I have one other question. So you said for a 2-hour lecture, you have 5 or 6 learning goals. Something I struggle with is sort of deciding sort of what material not to cover.
Yeah.
Because let's say, sort of usually in, let's say in a 200 level atmospheric science class,
Yeah.
so you're expected to go over a range of concepts and So what what do you not cover?
How do you
And-
choose?
And you have to make decisions because to accommodate these things,
Right.
obviously, so you can cover everything, so.
It's really challenging, but it's such a good exercise as an instructor, I think, to really distill it down, to ask yourself, what are the most important concepts here? They might not need to know every little piece of, you know, what you're currently teaching them. Maybe they do, but I think it's a useful exercise to pare it down. Because you're right, you absolutely have to take up material in order to fit in things like this, there's no question. But yeah, I mean, I wish we could all do a research study where you know, you teach your class with a lecture and you cram in all this material that you think should be there, and then you teach it totally differently with the, you know, active learning, and then you do like these pre and post tests, and then maybe a test 6 months later even, or 3 months later, and see how much students have retained. I guarantee that they've retained more from the active learning, but you can't do an experiment like that, because it's, you know, you're manipulating students too much, but it would be very interesting to see, I think. But my strong feeling is that they retain more from being active with the material than just listening to it. So then you just have to decide, yeah, what is the most important for them to learn.
So with number 3, how will the students be motivated to put in the effort, right? So the carrots would be, what, participation rate or?
Yep, so
Yeah.
for sure, that works. I mean,
Yeah.
I have really good attendance in my classes, and I guarantee it's mostly because of the participation grade. I
Yeah.
like to also think they
Yeah.
enjoy the classes, but,
Yeah,
you know,
you're
they.
assessing them as they're doing these group work.
Yeah, and it's not just attendance, like
Yeah.
they have to complete something to get those
And then they
points.
hand it in, and that goes to your TA.
Yeah, and sometimes.
Yeah, does your TA do the coordinating participation
I
works?
do them,
Do you?
yeah.
Do you ever have a TA come to class to actually assist you with any of these class activities?
I haven't actually, but that probably would be a good idea, yeah. I just feel like in this class anyway, they are running the tutorials, so they're already really busy with the
Right,
students.
yeah, that
Right.
makes sense. And do you post the, I know you don't have too many lecture slides, but do you post these materials to Canvas?
Yeah, I post them before and after class, because I'll often, like I did today, type in actually information from the students as we're discussing something, and then that'll go into the post-class
Yeah.
slides, so, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so they always have the slides from my classes beforehand, so they know the learning goals going in.
Yeah.
And if though I'm using things like the clicker questions,
Yeah.
I'll leave those out of the slides so that they're
Yeah.
surprised by them in the
Yeah.
class.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I'll put them into the post-class slides though, but not with the answers. So they have to be in class, or at least if they're not in class and they see that question, they need to figure out the answer on their own.
And your midterm and final exams are fairly traditional?
Yep,
Yeah, and
Mostly-
testing on what they've learned in the activity learning and tutorials.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So it's about
Yeah,
half
so
multiple
it's,
choice, half short answer type of
Yeah,
thing.
yeah. Got it.
Yeah, they're really traditional exams, mine,
Yeah.
but with the group component
Yeah.
as well.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. I was gonna do a whole other activity, but we don't have time, so.
I'm
That-
interested though.
I know, so, okay, what-
How would it work?
So